Support for Amplified Voices comes from the Restorative Action Foundation. Learn more at restorativeactionalliance.org.
Everyone has a voice, a story to tell. Some are marginalized and muted. What if there were a way to amplify those stories, to have conversations with real people in real communities, a way to help them step into the power of their lived experience? Welcome to Amplified Voices, a podcast lifting the experiences of people and families impacted by the criminal legal system. Together, we can create positive change for everyone.
Hello, and welcome to a special episode of Amplified Voices. I'm your host, Jason, here with my co-host, Amber. Good morning, Amber.
Good morning, Jason.
And today we have back a returning guest, and we're going to be covering something that's very timely and important, which is why we're holding this special episode today. And it's Barbara Fair, and she's here to talk about the PROTECT Act and what's going on in Connecticut and what we need to do. Hello, Barbara.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for the opportunity.
It's great to see you again. And, usually we ask, how did you get involved with the criminal legal system? But today we're going to jump right over all that. And we're going to talk about the PROTECT Act and where it stands. And so I'm going to just turn the floor over to you. If you could, just to bring people back into it, what is the PROTECT Act and where does it stand right now?
Okay, first of all, I'm part of Stop Solitary Connecticut, and I'm on their steering committee and their lead organizer. And so the PROTECT Act is really about how do we protect the people behind bars? How do we have transparency? How do we help those people that have to work in corrections to be mentally well and feel safe in doing their job? And so that's what the intention is behind the bill. And how do we stop the abuses that are sanctioned by our state government? And how do we protect those people who are enduring that pain and trauma every day? And so the PROTECT Act, we've been working on for years. But this session, what we did almost every single day, we were at the Capitol while the Capitol was closed during the pandemic. We stood out there each day handing out information, briefings to all the legislators as they went into the building, because we wanted to make sure they were well informed about the PROTECT Act and what we're trying to do and hopefully get their votes. And so when it actually came to the actual vote, the bill was passed. It was passed in the Senate, 26-10. It was passed in the House, 87-55. And so we were very joyous about that. We had talked to the governor.
I remember the day it went to the House, there was a huge debate.
Yes.
And I remember that the Stop Solitary team was outside. For people that even weren't there, we could feel your excitement, but also the tension.
Yes.
We followed that debate from where we were, and it was a long one.
Yes.
There was a lot of interesting things that were said at that point from people that supported the bill. And then there were also people that stood up, and it seemed to kind of take a turn.
Right.
When one of the representatives stood up and said, I used to work in corrections.
When people like that stand up and say, one of the two, because we've had people who work in corrections who admit that is a very abusive and degrading environment. And then we have those who work there or who have family members who work there now, who are currently involved, and they want to support the people who are working there. So they will continue to tell these stories of these extreme scenarios to justify why they do what they do. And so that was expected. What I didn't expect was the representative who talked about the Cheshire incident and what happened with that family. And I'm sure everybody knows about that. Very violent, very horrific, and used that as an example of why they have to have something like solitary confinement to control these kind of people. What was most misleading about that is that the two people who committed that horrific act, neither one of them are in Connecticut right now, suffering under these conditions. Both have been shipped out to other states. One I know for a fact is actually in a medium security, not even a maximum security facility. So to use that as a reason to say, this is why we do what we do because we have these kind of people among us was very misleading. With that, you heard some people stand and say, you know what? I came in here with a yes vote, but after hearing this, I have to change my vote to no. And so that really bothered us. because we couldn't respond to what she was saying.
It's really important that you bring that up, because what we see a lot is emotion getting inserted into debates
Yes.
and outlier situations, which are horrific,
Hmm.
that we all feel empathy about, that again are individualized cases that are utilized to kind of rebut systemic problems.
Right.
So rather than comparing apples to apples, you're comparing apples to oranges.
Right.
So that is something that happens quite often in debates. So that day, that did change some hearts and minds based on emotion rather than what we see as the normal thing that is happening and affecting many, many people.
Right.
I'm glad that you shared that.
Yes.
So Barbara and the Stop Solitary team was standing outside all those days, and they actually made a connection with people and they changed those minds. And then they're brought back because somebody stands up and says, well, this is why we need it. And they would say, well, we're deferring to the quote experts.
Right.
And we had this conversation before we turned on the cameras, and that it really matters who you define as an expert.
Right.
If you only define the people who have a vested interest in their jobs and job security as experts versus defining the people who have actually been through this system and felt the pain. The last time we had you on as a guest, you talked about the lasting consequences to your family and what's happened with your son.
Yes.
And I still take that with me everywhere I go. I think about your story and I think about you. We've had Tracy Bernardi on as a guest. We haven't released that episode yet, but she talked about what was done to her and people that she knows behind bars. And so to me, people who have lived that experience are experts, and they need to be regarded as experts just as much as somebody who's on the other side getting paid to supervise what's going on in our prisons.
Yes. When you look at people like Tracy and my son and so many others in our community, you realize how deep the damage is. And some of those stories were told at the public hearing that we had a month earlier. And I'm sure some of these people who voted against us heard those stories. But the day of the vote, the story that they heard was the story of what happened in Cheshire. And so it was very manipulative to bring that story up, knowing that those people are not in Connecticut suffering, that the people in Connecticut suffering are people like my son who just resisted being treated in an inhumane manner. And when the guard jerked on his chain, he jerked back, and then he ended up in Northern the day he turned 17. At that early age, when your mind is still forming, to be tortured like that for months, some people don't come back from that. And people need to understand that this is human torture.
Right.
And I also think that a lot of times people don't really hear our stories because they really can't connect with our humanity. That's all I can think of. Because how do you hear these stories and you say, you know, this is wrong, we shouldn't be doing it? How could you not do that? So I think of the fact that in many of these places where people are held 22 hours a day and those 23 hours a day and chained up in those horrible positions, almost 90% of those people are Black and brown. Is that the disconnect? I don't really know. It's just hard for me to understand, how does anybody say that we should be doing this to another human being and it's okay?
Exactly.
Barbara, that really makes me think of the recent op-ed that you wrote that was entitled Necessary Tool, kind of what you were just talking about, not being able to connect with humanity. Can you talk a little bit about that op-ed and what your thoughts were in putting that forward?
What drove me was hearing over and over again in every debate about solitary is where someone from DOC will come forth and always use the same thing, that this is a necessary tool for correction officers. And so I hear that over and over again, and it just brought to mind the particular date I wrote this letter to the editor, all the necessary tools that have been introduced to control the lives of African people, beginning with the leather whip that was used to whip them until they gave up any connection to Africa, till they accepted a name that the master wanted him to have, giving up their religion, their language, everything. So that was like the first necessary tool that America used against Africans. And then I think about the lynchings that people would go and watch in You see some of the old historical pictures where families were standing around smiling and taking pictures with African people hanging on trees in the background. And then I think about how another necessary tool to break the women and the men is the raping of women and girls, sometimes right in front of their fathers and husbands. There are just so many necessary tools. And then I think about the more subtle tools like redlining, segregation, the 50-year-old war on drugs, felony disenfranchisement. And then this one that has lasted for just as long as almost the war on drugs is this isolating people in these tight spaces with no connection to another human being, and doing that for days and weeks and years, and some people for decades. And if anyone can think about their pet, because people connect with their pets where they can't connect with the lives of African Americans and Latinos. Think of your pet being placed in this tiny little space, and it's dirty and it's filthy and it's dark. And think of putting them in there and having a little slit in that space to shove their food in. And think about leaving them there for days and weeks and months and years. And then is your expectation that when you open that cage, that they're suddenly going to come out wagging their tail and licking? They're going to be angry and furious and ready to attack. And so that's the part that really bothers me about this whole situation, is after they have done this harm to people, they justify saying, well, they're so violent, we have to keep them locked up for the safety and security of other people and correctional officers, when if you had never harmed them and tortured them in the first place, you wouldn't have that worry. So I understand why people are concerned about what do we do with those people who've been at Northern that we've been treating like wild animals for days and years. I can see the concern. What happens now if we let them out? What the concern should have been in the beginning is, why are we allowing this to happen? And we really should be concerned about, why are we allowing it to continue to happen? And then we have to also think about, some of these people have not even been convicted of anything. Some of them are pre-trial, just been accused, like my son at 16 years old at the time he was accused. And they damaged him before his 17th birthday ended. And they damaged him. I don't want to think for life. I want to always have hope.
Right.
But I mean, it's been almost 20 years and he still suffers.
And some of the things that they use to justify it, we're only putting them in for short amounts of time because we need to separate them, like a timeout.
Yeah.
Your average person that doesn't touch this issue thinks we're just separating them and putting them in a timeout. Well, first of all, you're not putting them in a nice room,
right,
sitting around having a cup of coffee. It's not that kind of a timeout. You've talked about the torture. And the other thing is, when you ask people, what are the reasons that you were sent in the first place? And you hear stories like, I just learned that a loved one had passed away and I hugged somebody and they threw me in.
Mm-hmm.
Or I was going to the bathroom when they called for a roll.
Yes.
And I was still going, and they decided that they were mad at me that day for that. Or they found something on my bed, I hadn't put it there, and they put me into solitary for that. So you can hear story after story of
yes
reasons that are just, are you kidding me? That is not the guys from Cheshire in there causing some sort of issue.
Yeah. And the more recent ones are the guys who, during COVID, because they were being totally disregarded, just talked about, let's have a hunger strike or something. So that, in the opinion of DOC, is a disruption of the safety and security of the prison. They use those words all the time. So because someone talked about how can we fight back without fighting back, that was a reason to send that person to Northern, because Northern is called a control unit. And what they do, anyone who they perceive as a threat in any kind of manner, it can just be in the way you're looking at an officer or talking back, any kind of a threat, you're sent to Northern so that they can control you. It's about how do they break your spirit, break your will, and leave you so devastated that you're unable to do anything to be a threat to them at all. And so as I talk about Northern, I just want to make that little point also about Northern. We've managed to get Northern shut down July 1st. So a lot of people probably think, oh, well, that's great. The abuse has stopped now. Now we're on a better path. The reality is I get letters from the people who got transferred out, and they say all they did was transfer what was going on in Northern over to Walker CI, to another facility. So nothing has really changed. Closing Northern was a hollow victory because they brought the abuse right to another facility, which is something Stop Solitary was concerned about from day one. We said we have to make sure Northern's closed, is demolished, so it's never used again, and the abuses that are going on will end when Northern's closed. Those were our three main points, and it didn't happen. Just Northern closed, that's it.
Let me bring us back to the day it passed the House. So despite the objections, it passed, and cheering.
Yes.
You guys were out in the rain. You were so excited. We were cheering with you, and it looked like it was a done deal.
Yes. I felt like a whole weight have lifted off my shoulders. I went on vacation, and I said, even after vacation, because of how much it took out of me to be up there every day, all the work that we had to do, we did podcasts, radio shows, we did all kinds of things to get the word out. And I felt like, okay, that weight is lifted. I'm going to go on vacation. Then I'm going to come back and take a couple of months off from the work and then get back in, because I know we got a lot of work ahead.
Right.
Closing Northern was one little step. But I come back from my vacation and I hear the governor hasn't signed the bill. But before I went on vacation, we talked to the governor and I asked him, was he going to sign our bill? And he said, oh, I have no problem. We have a video of him saying, I have no problem with that. I said, okay, so thank you. So read it and, sign it and we'll be excited. And then when I come back and find he hasn't signed it yet, it made me kind of nervous. Like, what's going on? He said he had no problem with it. So then I found out the day that he vetoed the bill, DOC had came out with their poor me, sad, pitiful, I need this to run the prison stories. And they did that 4 minutes before the veto was announced. So obviously the governor caved into DOC, who he feels is experts because he doesn't know anything about what goes in prison. So he just takes the words of DOC. And so he vetoed the bill and then gave an executive order, which to me is like giving a pacifier to a starving baby. That was supposed to, I guess, make us be happy and satisfied with what he did.
So before you left and all the days that you guys were up there talking to legislators, it passes both houses. The governor has said, I need to read the bill. I plan to sign it. And then it's like radio silence. Throughout this process, did the governor or the governor's office sit down with the advocates and have a conversation about the bill and get their direct input?
Never. We approached his office several times while we were putting the bill together. Even when we were getting the language developed, we kept asking him, would he meet with us? Never, ever did he meet with us. And that's when, like I said, I talked to one of his staff and I said, why does he seem to be so indifferent to incarcerated people? And he said, to be honest, that's not his thing. And he showed that. He showed it throughout COVID. Because when he put forth this executive order, my question was, where was the executive order when people were getting sick and dying of COVID? Where was the executive order then? I mean, he put forth a lot of executive orders to protect other people in situations, but there was no executive order for the incarcerated people. So why an executive order now? And I think it's like this was supposed to appease us or make those who are unaware of what's really going on believe that, okay, we've solved the problem. They're working together and we don't have to worry anymore. Everything's going to be cool. But it's far from the truth.
I want to reiterate for people who may not be in Connecticut who are listening that the advocates in Connecticut were not silent about the risks of prison and COVID. We were watching as they were reporting numbers, and there was sometimes transparency, sometimes no transparency. And so there were plenty of opportunities to actually address and people coming forward with solutions.
In talking about that executive order, could you explain for the benefit of those listening how the executive order fell short?
Well, the reason it doesn't solve the problem is because he's listening to Department of Corrections lay out the plan. Let me just step back 1 minute when we talk about Department of Corrections. The Commissioner of Corrections was unanimously confirmed as commissioner on the very day that he had a lawsuit pending against him for his involvement in actual abusing prisoners. Now, is this the person that we want to lead this department into a humane environment? Can we even expect that? I didn't expect it. But I did have few conversations with the commissioner, and I said to him, I'm aware that you have a lawsuit pending against you. I'm aware you've had other lawsuits pending against you before now. But I'd like to believe that maybe throughout the years, you have changed the person that you were. And so let's try to work on how we get the PROTECT Act passed. And his very first thing is he did not want any community involvement, no oversight from the community. And he didn't want it to become law. He said that on the day of his confirmation. So he was pushing back right from the beginning. And so that told me right there that we were going to have some problems. But he did meet with us for a little while until I started forwarding emails to him from people in prison talking about the conditions. And then I said to him, I tried to believe that you were a different person. That's why I've been working with you. But when I get these emails from people inside, that tells me that you're not being honest. And I say, without honesty, we really don't have a relationship. And so that was the last time he communicated with me. And so that part fell apart. But when we talk about the executive order, for instance, he talked about Mandela rules. Now, I know the governor has no clue about that because the Mandela rules are the minimum standards of care that you should give to people that are incarcerated. And the minimum standards is 22 hours a day. No one should be locked up longer than that. And that's the minimum. Is that what we're trying to go for? The minimum standards of humanity? So that tells me he doesn't know much about the Mandela rules when he said that this is what should happen. The very first thing he said was that the state of Connecticut and the Constitution of the United States dictates that the state should deliver a standard of treatment of incarcerated people consistent with evolving community standards. Well, evolving community standards is far from what we're doing here in Connecticut. Places like Colorado, New York, Massachusetts, they've all started to evolve in their standards. So right from the start, we're not doing that. The second one was about the Mandela rules, which, like I said, those should not be the standards we should be trying to put our community through. Another thing he said, Connecticut has taken substantial steps to reduce the use of isolated confinements by, among other steps, closing Northern. We know closing Northern didn't move us any closer to ending the abuse at all. And then he went on to say they're going to do all of these things under his executive order, but if he really wanted these things to happen, because he said he supported what we were trying to do. That's what he said in his statement. Well, if you really supported that, there was no need for an executive order. Just sign the bill.
Yeah.
But the difference between the bill becoming law and just an executive order is he can rescind that anytime he wants to. And so that's why I feel that that was like giving a pacifier to a starving baby. Anything to quiet you down and hope you'll go away.
Right.
And that's not going to happen because we are having an event on Wednesday where we are publicly demanding the legislators continue this issue because it's a work left undone. They did their greatest part when they passed the bill. We were just euphoric about that. But then the veto came. The stroke of a pen of one man nullified all our voices, thousands of voices across the state, all kind of advocacy groups, legislators, just nullified all of our voices with the stroke of his pen. And that's why Wednesday, we're going to be at the Capitol at 10 o'clock in the morning, and we're going to publicly demand that legislators complete their job. And their job is to override this veto and nothing less.
I want to emphasize a couple things you said. The difference between an executive order and a law is that he can rescind it or the next administration.
Right.
He's out and somebody else comes in. It's a lot easier to just change it.
Mm-hmm.
So you described it as something that doesn't even have everything we want in it.
Right.
But even the small gains that are in there could go away at any time. That's unacceptable.
Yeah.
The second thing is you're talking about people gathering Wednesday, July the 14th.
Right.
Wednesday, the capital of Connecticut is in Hartford. So if you want to go there, and what time?
It's going to be 10 o'clock, 210 Capitol Avenue, Hartford.
Okay, at 210 Capitol Avenue, Hartford. So that's one thing. And the other thing I want to ask you about, and we might talk about this again some more at the end, is besides showing up and showing support and amplifying it online and everything else, What are we asking people to do? What can people do at this point?
Well, people who want to do a little bit more, or if that's all they can do, is email their legislator. They can call their legislator because now they're starting to come back into the Capitol. So hopefully they'll get to talk to someone, or just go to Hartford, to the Capitol, because now it's open to the public. Find out who your legislator is, meet with your legislator and say you are totally in support of them overriding this veto. And one of the important places that we need to reach is Ritter, people in his area, which is the more affluent part of Hartford. We need those people to speak up. We need to have their voices because he is going to be instrumental in whether we call this up for an override in the first place. And so we need people from across the state to reach out to their legislators, but we also need the people in Ritter's vicinity.
That's Representative Matt Ritter.
Yes, we need people in his district, which I said is the affluent part of Hartford. We need them to voice an opinion in support of humanity, because really this is not a political issue. This is a human rights issue. This is about human lives and what we as a people and a society accept happening to people. We can't close our eyes to it because it doesn't happen to us. They're still part of our community. And when they talk about safety, and they're always bringing that up, oh, it's all about safety. Well, how safe is our families and our communities when our family members are being tortured and then they're coming back home? And then we have to somehow understand what they've been through and help them get better if we ever can, or they bring a lot of violence from what happened to them. So when we talk about safety, it can't just be about the safety of the affluent communities who are not touched by prisons. We have to talk about the safety of our communities and our families when these tortured people who are broken in spirit and everything come back home. And most of them will come back home.
That is so important when we talk about how we define public and how we define safety.
Yes.
So every person in the state of Connecticut, regardless of where they live, what their color is, how much money they have, deserves safety.
Yes.
And these practices do not create safety for anyone. And systems can engulf anyone.
Mm-hmm.
As a person who has a loved one who has been affected by solitary confinement, it disproportionately affects people who are poor.
Mm-hmm.
It disproportionately affects people who have been marginalized, people of color.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have a system, it can engulf anyone at any time.
Yes.
And that's what we have to tear down, is a system that harms and doesn't help.
Right. And that's why I don't focus on Commissioner Quiros or the governor. I focus on a system that allows these people to operate the way they do. And we, the people, are part of that system. We help build that system and we can help tear it down. So it's our choice which one we want to do.
Usually we talk to our guests, but I want to speak directly to our listeners right now, especially the ones in Connecticut. If you are not speaking out against the use of solitary confinement in Connecticut, this is your chance right now to be on the right side. This is torture being done in our names by the state, and we need to do what we can to stop it. This is a human rights issue, and we need to do what we can. And that means calling your friends, calling your representatives, calling your senators, and telling them that you support the PROTECT Act and you expect them to bring this forward and vote on it and pass this thing and get it over the finish line.
Mm-hmm. One of the other things we found when we were trying to get the word out, want to set up with libraries in some of those affluent communities that really are not touched by prisons, except that the prisons are in their community, so they benefit in that way. Places like Cheshire and Enfield, and both of those libraries turned us down because they don't want to speak against corrections because they have family members that work in there. And so that's a huge part of our battle, is those places that really should speak up against what's going on in their backyard don't want to do so if it means that they have to speak against what's going on inside of corrections when they have family members and friends who work there. So that's another huge hurdle that we have to deal with.
It does make sense that people would want to protect their livelihood.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense that people want to protect systems that they don't fully understand.
Mm-hmm.
But let's again go back to how we define safety. If you are working in an environment where violence is the norm, whether you are a person who works for that system or you're a person who is controlled by that system, you are in danger.
Mm-hmm.
That does not create safety for anyone. And I go back to the public hearing that we had on this bill. We had many people who had gone in and out of working for corrections who said, I didn't feel safe in my job because of this practice.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to provide mental health care and I was unable to do it because of these practices.
Mm-hmm.
We want to see safety for everyone. So this is not an anti-DOC bill.
Right.
This is a pro-DOC bill and safety and value for every single person.
Right. And part of our bill spoke to that because we have people actually on our committee who have worked in corrections, one who worked over 30 years, and he's been very instrumental in trying to talk to other correctional staff. And we have one who was there and ended up leaving. And one of the cases that caused her to finally say, I can't do this anymore, and she was a mental health worker, was the case of the young man in Whaley Avenue who had severe mental health issues. The DOC knew that, and he was placed in solitary in one of those solitary cells. He was maced with a great amount of mace and left there. And then when they came back, he was dead. And no one was really held accountable for his death. That shows how sick this system is. They actually charged his mother $200 a day for his incarceration, including the day that they ended up killing him. Now, how sick can you be? And that's what I say about this system. It's so sadistic, but not only is it deeply sadistic, it's deeply racist too, because I hear letters all the time. And one that just kind of broke me down just a few days ago, one of the men talking about how the guards would handcuff them behind their backs and then beat them up. I just imagine that happened to my son. And I'm saying, how do those people turn out after this happens to them? They're going to be enraged. I've worked with people who came out of halfway houses and tried to get them to debrief from the experience. And the ones who talked about dreams that they have of killing the COs who harmed them when they was behind bars and trying to get that out of them. Those people are walking around in our community. And then when we see all this violence and mayhem and drug addiction, where a lot of them went to drugs and alcohol to kind of cope with what happened to them, and people they look at that, but they don't see how the roots of where this all started. They don't see how we have teenagers who are put in rooms for 22 hours a day, locked away. And for God knows how long they're in there. But those kids come back to our community. Then we see things happening that teens are involved in, and we're all ready to bring out the punitive measures. But do we ever take a look at the roots of where's all that coming from? Because this is not only happening to grown men and women, this is happening to our kids. And again, in the juvenile system, the kids that it's happening to, disproportionately African-American and Latino. And we have to stop looking at their behavior and start looking at the roots of their behavior. And what is our responsibility to stop that from happening? We can start with making sure that this veto is overrode. That's the first thing that we can do. That's just the beginning of the work, because there's so many things that this bill doesn't even touch. The everyday people locked in cages 22 hours a day, and not only for punitive measures, that's how the system is run. This is what the COs are pushing back on, because the thought that we said we have to let people out 4 to 6 hours a day, for decades, they keep people in cages 22 hours a day, let them out for an hour to use the phone and exercise, keep them caged up. That's a nice, easy 8-hour shift, making good money, great benefits. And so we know why they're pushing back. And I'm getting letters all the time from the people in Cheshire who getting locked down now 23 hours a day because they're pushing back on the bill. They're saying, if this is what they're going to do, we're going to start calling out. And so a lot of them have been calling out. So now the excuse to not let people out is we don't have enough staff. Well, that's their strategy to push back on this bill. And those are the kind of things that made the governor cave in, because the CEOs are saying, if you're going to let people out, we just won't come to work. Now, why is that allowed?
Right. And so one of the provisions of the bill dealt with this issue of transparency.
Mhm.
We hear a lot pushback. Again, these are the things that we're hearing from people who have actually been incarcerated, who have experienced it. We hear a lot that this is a myth, it's over exaggerated. And so, again, when you look at protecting everyone, hence the name, the PROTECT Act,
Mhm.
that transparency would protect the actual DOC because there would be someone that would actually see what was happening.
Right.
So let's just play devil's advocate. Somebody's exaggerating about the situation that happened to them, which I'm not suggesting that that's true.
Oh, yeah, I hear you. Mhm.
But if you have an ombudsman and you have transparency, then you're protecting yourself because you know that people know what's going on behind bars.
Yes. And that's why we wanted someone independent. We didn't want someone from inside to make these decisions about what's a valid issue and what's not, because we know that many times if you have people policing themselves, they're going to go on the side of the people that they work next to every day, as opposed to the person who's incarcerated. And so that's why we want an independent oversight. Commissioner, from day one, he didn't want no eyes on DOC at all.
Right. As we talk about the components of the bill and what people can do, we're going to continue to let people know what they can do. You can visit stopsolitaryct.org. Is that correct?
Yes.
And for those who are not sure who your representative is or how to contact them, if this is the day that you're going to get involved in providing feedback to your legislators, it's a great issue to do it on. So you can either visit Stop Solitary, you can visit the Connecticut General Assembly website to find out who your representative is, which is cga.ct.gov. Yeah, so we'll put it in the notes. And then on Wednesday, which is the 14th at 10 a.m. at 210 Capitol Drive in Hartford, there will be an action with Stop Solitary CT. If you are someone who can't make it up there, there's a lot of opportunity on social media to amplify the message. Stop Solitary has a great Twitter account and a Facebook page. All of that can be found on their website as well. Is that correct?
Yes. When you go to Stop Solitary, there's a petition that comes up first. Once you sign that petition, that automatically puts you in our email list. So anything that's going on with Stop Solitary, you will automatically receive an email.
Fabulous.
So Barbara, you've just done such amazing work in Connecticut
And beyond.
and beyond at this point, right? And you've worked so hard and you just keep going and going like the Energizer Bunny. You're an inspiration to me and so many people that I've talked with, people who just know your name now, and anybody who comes across you thinks the world of you. So
Thank you.
and you have so much to be proud of, and you've done so much good stuff. And I wish we were here today celebrating this new law.
We will. It's coming.
And so regardless of what happens, we as a collective have the power to move this forward. And it's all about everyone getting involved. Is that right, Barbara?
That's all it takes. It's all to get involved. And many times when we have events, people are nervous that, oh, I don't know how to speak. You don't even have to speak. Just show up. Show up wearing our shirts. That says so much to this governor who thinks that because a few DOC people came out, he can just cave into their pressure. He needs to know that there's pressure on the other side, too, to do the right thing.
100%.
And so every person in Connecticut has a responsibility to speak out, speak up, to stop the torture that's going on in our name in the state.
Right. Otherwise, silence is complicity. Silence is accepting what's happening. So again, thank you so much for the opportunity to amplify the voices around Connecticut. And we're going to do this. I'm very confident.
All right. Until next time, Amber.
We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Amplified Voices, a podcast lifting the experiences of people and families impacted by the criminal legal system. For more information, episodes, and podcast notes, visit amplifiedvoices.show.